Welcome back to the channel. I'm Kevin, and today I'm going to be walking you through my first ever commission, which also happens to be the biggest and most complicated cosplay prop I've ever made. Along the way, I'll talk about what I actually did, as well as what I really wish I'd done instead, because I made a lot of mistakes on this project, which hopefully you can avoid by watching this video. This is the Stardust Staff from Final Fantasy XIV. This is normally where I'd give some context for the prop, but I've never played a Final Fantasy game in my life. This all started about 3 months ago, when I had coffee with an old friend. We used to go to anime conventions together, and he still manages to find time to go, and mentioned he was interested in doing this cosplay. I volunteered to make the staff, and he offered to pay for my expenses, plus a little bit on the top as a thank you. It's pretty much the plot of My Dress Up Darling, except instead of love-struck teenagers, we're both men in our 30s. Going into this, I expected most of the details on the staff to be protruding, which is relatively easy to do. When I took a closer look at the reference images, I realized that most of the intricate details are actually engraved into a curving surface, which was going to be much more difficult. It really pains me to admit this, but I think the first mistake I made on this project was volunteering to do it in the first place. I knew I was capable of it, and I was looking for a challenge that would really push me, which this definitely did. That being said, I did bite off a lot more than I could comfortably chew. I think I was probably ready for a project of this scale or this complexity, since this was going to be the first time I worked with Arduinos, but doing it all in a single prop was a lot. Don't get me wrong, I'm very proud of the results, and I learned a tremendous amount. But as you'll see in the next few minutes, I also encountered a lot of challenges. I want to start by addressing the sheer size of this. As I was getting into this, my friend linked me to a Reddit post which included this image. Knowing nothing about Final Fantasy character creation, I decided to use this image as the basis for the measurements. It's shown as being taller than the character, and my friend is a tall guy, so I decided to make this 6 feet tall. Later on, I saw more images of this and realized it didn't need to be quite that large, but by that point I was already printing this. Once I decided on the scale, I moved into modeling, which took me probably 20 or more hours between my different attempts. Originally, I was just doing the external geometry, but later I went back and redid this to include an internal channel for a piece of PVC, which I would use to add rigidity and help join the pieces together. I created extra meshes to outline all of the engraved details. Then I went through with a knife tool and cut where those extra meshes intersected with a staff. I divided the staff in half and later mirrored it, so I only had to do this on one side. The knife tool left a lot of duplicate vertices, which weren't immediately obvious and caused issues later on. So after every cut, I had to go back and check all of the vertices and reconstruct the geometry in a number of places. Once I had outlined the details to be engraved in the staff, I'd select all the faces, extrude them, and scale everything down in the X and Y dimensions. This approach worked, but the whole process was very time-consuming. One unexpected issue was my lack of stamina. I post projects at least once a month, and that involves a fair amount of work in Blender, but I'm still very much a hobbyist and not a professional, which is probably obvious if you've seen any of my other videos. I wanted to knock out the modeling on this in a few long sessions, but I found myself burning out after a few hours and having to stop because I was worried I was going to make a really big mistake and set myself back. This hasn't been as much of an issue on my other projects because they're generally a lot smaller scale, at least compared to this, and the deadlines are generally more flexible. To add some context, this is a dagger I did about 6 months ago, which took me a couple of hours to model. I think the entire modeling, printing, and finishing process on this was probably faster than just modeling the staff. I kept working my way up the staff until I got to the flames on the top. That's when I encountered the really complicated part. To make this glow, I needed to put a battery, an Arduino, and LED strips inside of this piece, along with some plastic pieces to diffuse the light. What I ended up doing was starting with the external geometry and working my way in. It's not an exaggeration to say that these internal spaces were an afterthought, and they were irregular and really pretty awkward to work in. What I really wish I'd done instead is start with all of the internal spaces, and not just that channel for the PVC, and then work my way out from there. I think that would have addressed a lot of the issues that I ended up having when assembling this and trying to wire everything in such a weird space. I divide this up for printing using 200mm cubes and Boolean intersect modifiers. To get this done in time, I actually started printing the bottom of the staff before finishing the top. Modeling ended up taking way longer than I expected, so I was looking for any way I could possibly speed this up. That led to some rushed decision making. Dividing this up with cubes was not the best choice, especially not for the top. I ended up with some disconnected pieces, which made the assembly much more difficult and resulted in more visible joins. I also stranded these little pieces, which were so insultingly small, I felt embarrassed when I had to go back and print them. I updated the files before uploading this online, so if you're trying to print your own, you should have a slightly easier time. This was something I had to deal with, along with other challenges, like how to divide this up for transport. I did ask if this could be one giant piece, which I figured wouldn't work, but would have made my life so much easier. As expected, this needed to break down into a few smaller pieces, so it could fit in a car with a bunch of other luggage. This was a problem because I need to run wires from the top, with one section of LEDs, the Arduino, and the batteries, down to the bottom, which has another glowing section. Before talking about everything that went wrong with that, let's take a look at the electronics. I bought the LEDs for this project for about 20 bucks. These LEDs I purchased are grouped in sets of 3. A lot of the tutorials you'll see online use individually addressable LEDs, where every single one can be set to be a different color, which is really cool and lets you do some more elaborate animations, but is also about 3 times the price. I just wanted to set and change the color of all of the LEDs at once, so I decided to save some money and go with this. I decided to run everything off of an Arduino Nano, which was about 15 bucks for 3. I'm powering everything from a 12-volt rechargeable battery, which is what the LED strip runs on and the Nano can manage. I watched some tutorials from Kamoi Cosplay and found them to be a great introduction to this. I did end up going a slightly different direction than her, because her setup is a little pricier and gives you more options, which makes sense because she moves it between different projects. I'm planning to seal all of this up inside the staff, so I wanted it to be as cheap and simple as possible. This is what my circuitry ended up looking like, although it's a lot cleaner here than in practice. For the bottom of the staff, I printed an insert which would fit over this central column, so it could wire everything up and then slip it in place without having to work in such an awkward confined space. This worked pretty well and was one of my more clever ideas on this project. Originally I tried using shorter lengths of LEDs, so I could do a fancier rotating pattern, but I'm not that great at soldering and got frustrated after burning myself, so I just cut a short length and wrapped it around here, which is what I should have done in the first place. I slipped in a thin bit of plastic which I'd sprayed with some frosting spray, which was like 6 bucks at Home Depot, to help diffuse the light. That wasn't quite enough, so I ended up gluing on 2 layers of fabric, which is billed as being good at diffusing LED light. This made it look a little bit better, but the individual LEDs were still quite visible. I was really pretty bummed about this, because I put a lot of effort in, and had really hoped this would diffuse better. It ended up being fine, because in pictures it all looks like it's glowing pretty nicely, but I was definitely down on myself at this point. I didn't have a better idea though, so I moved on to connecting all the pieces together. My idea was to use a wooden dowel, which would fit inside this PVC pipe, and I would hold it in place with some small machine screws. I knew I needed a nut to hold the screw in place, but I didn't have room to put it outside of the PVC, so I decided to incorporate it into the dowel itself. Some of you at home are probably thinking that sounds like a terrible idea, and you would be completely correct. I couldn't really carve out a nice slot for the nut to go in the dowel, so I decided to just drill a hole, which seemed like a great idea until 3 AM that night when I woke up and realized I was being a moron. The nut needs to be captured, or else it will just spin endlessly when I'm trying to remove the screw. I wouldn't actually be able to detach the pieces with the setup I currently have. I found the answer to this problem, like most problems in life, was 3D printing. I modeled this piece which captures the nut and could be slotted into the dowel, which actually worked pretty well. I wanted the screw to make contact with both sides of the PVC, but it was a little bit too short, so I ended up shaving down one side of the PVC tube so it could reach. This was version 1. I used my Dremel tool to carve a channel along the side to run the wires through. I applied a bunch of 2-part epoxy and assembled everything. At the end, I went back and checked that the electronics still worked, and discovered that the lower portion did not. I was so upset as I had to cut this apart. I figured that one of my soldered connections had broken as it was moving stuff around, but it turned out to be much dumber than that. I had a little hole where I fed the wires into the inside channel so they could run up through the PVC pipe. I got the length of the PVC wrong and pushed it down too much, which absolutely guillotined these wires. While I was trying to rebuild this, I ran into another issue. A length of PVC was now stuck inside of the lower portion. I did my best to get it out, but it won the day and stayed in place, while I ended up losing a bunch of skin on my finger. In my brain, this all worked kind of like tent poles, where the pieces would go together, but then you could pull them out and fold them over, and there would still be a bit of filament running between the two, connecting them. In order to make this work and have that filament connecting everything, I needed to have some extra wire inside of the PVC pipe. It came out to about 12 inches as a rough measurement, which worked really well in my head, but not so much in practice. I was imagining the wire to be more like thread, but it had a very different consistency in reality. I could get maybe an extra 2 or 3 inches in there, but after that, it did not want to cooperate. I was staring at this and wondering if I could actually get this to work, and even if I did, I wasn't sure I wouldn't just break the wires along the way. I reluctantly decided to run the wires outside of this, which wasn't really what I wanted to do, but the modeling had taken way longer than expected, and I needed a solution that I could work with. I also ended up driving a screw into the wooden dowel on these lower portions, because I realized there would be a lot of upwards and downwards force, and I didn't trust the adhesive alone. What I really should have done was prototype all of this before I did any significant modeling, so I could identify all of these problems way in advance. This was not something I was well equipped to handle, with 4 days remaining before my deadline. I rebuilt the lower portion as best I could. The plastic insert from last time ended up snapping, so I redid that, but then the gap between the pieces was too large for super glue or 2-part epoxy, so I reluctantly used some hot glue. I tried to cover all of this up with some wood filler, which did help mask the damage, but it still didn't look as good as it did before I had to cut it apart. For the top LEDs, I made another insert and attached all of the LEDs to that. This approach worked pretty well. I did forget to leave a hole to run the wires through, so I had to whip out my Dremel tool and add that. For the glowing ball on the top, I got a 6-inch acrylic globe off of Amazon, which is normally used for lighting fixtures. I needed to thread all of my electronics out of the back of this, so I figured out what areas would be covered and started cutting. I sprayed what was left of my globe with a bunch of frosting spray. I decided to go for a clear globe so I had complete control over this process, because I was feeling overly cocky when I started this, but I probably should have just gone for one that was already frosted. I don't have too much good footage from the rest of the assembly, because I managed to absolutely demolish my filming setup. Normally I have a little mechanical arm kind of like this, which holds my phone above my workspace so I can record what I'm doing. These pieces were so large, I managed to knock that and snap a piece, so the rest of this footage is kind of improvised. I connected the parts together as best I could, but they didn't fit perfectly, both because of mistakes I made and some slight warping. My workspace didn't make this any easier. This project really made me realize the limitations of my current workspace. I do pretty much everything on this broken IKEA drafting table, which I stole from my parents' garage when I was moving out. It works well enough for small stuff from Stardew Valley and the occasional solo leveling dagger, but not so much for a 6-foot staff. This had some real costs as the project went on. First off, everything took me longer than it should have, because I was constantly losing tools or having to rearrange crap so I had a space to work in. This also had a financial cost. I mentioned I ordered 3 Arduinos, but I ended up frying 2 of those. I got the leads crossed, and they went up in a puff of smoke. Some of that is just me being clumsy and new to electronics, which I totally own, but I think it would have been a lot less likely to happen if I had a clean and organized workspace. The last cost, which I didn't really see coming, was my sanity. I was cranky through pretty much this entire project because I was stressed about the deadlines, and when I did try to take a break and play some games, this was still on my mind because this required so much space, it overflowed onto every other surface in this room. I think after this one, I'm going to be doing a lot of unexciting off-camera organizational projects, so I never run into this again. Anyways, back on the staff, I continued to assemble and paint the pieces. I was using some hammered silver spray paint on this, which I hoped would hide some of the rougher areas, but the results weren't great. This does happen to be the first time I've done a prop large enough to justify using spray paint, so this might just have been user error. I was once again using this image as a reference, which is why I went for the silver, but everywhere else I see this depicted, it's a much darker color. At this point, I spent a few minutes and used scrap wood to make a rough base to hold up the top piece. It bent a little precariously, so I didn't leave it on here for long, but it was enough to let the paint dry, which was all I really needed. If I could do this all over again, I would be thinking about making something like this back in the design stage. Being able to prop this up would have made pretty much every aspect of this project easier, and I think my friend probably would have appreciated a more reliable way to transport this. I prepared some strips of frosted plastic and glued on some diffuser fabric. Installing these was chaotic, and I didn't get them to fit very nicely. This is one of many reasons that I wish I put more thought into these internal spaces. I ended up cutting and hot gluing sections of paint stirrers into this to hold up the LED strips, which worked, but wasn't really a great plan. Afterwards, I attached the final pieces, which didn't fit perfectly, and I ended up with a 2 to 3 millimeter gap in some areas. I used super glue wherever I had a flush fit, and hot glue wherever the gap was too large, which I didn't feel good about, but was the best I could do. After patching, priming, and painting everything silver, I went back and added black to the recessed details. I sprayed everything with a clear matte coat to seal the paint in and give it a bit of a shine. One of the final things I did was make a cute little door to go over the back panel, so if something ever goes really wrong, I can pull this off and hopefully I won't have to cut everything apart. One of the final tasks was to set the LED colors and animations. I reached out to my friend for a reference, and it looks like this alternates between pink and purple about every 3 seconds. This is the code I ended up writing. You can pause and take a screenshot if you're really interested, but it's nothing particularly impressive. In the end, I shifted between the 2 colors every 5 seconds, because it looked a little bit better. I couldn't get the exact shade of purple we see in the game, because I don't think it's actually possible with how light works, but I did turn down the brightness, so it's a little bit darker compared to the pink. I had hoped to knock this out in just a few minutes, but I'm a little bit rusty and got some stuff wrong with my ints and floats, so I had to do this several times. I was tremendously relieved as I glued the back panel in place.
Okay, so I just assembled this, and I'm about to do the first test with everything wired and assembled. You may see me cry depending on how this goes. Oh, thank God.
I delivered this to my friend and closed this one out. I'm tremendously proud of the results and I learned a ton. But if you were to ask me if I was going to make another prop of this scale and complexity, the answer would be no, or at least not anytime soon. This just took so much more effort than I was expecting, and I had to turn down plans with friends and delay some other commitments just to make it in time for the deadline. There's someone on Etsy selling their version of this for about $800, and honestly, that's a really good price given the work that goes into making something like this, especially considering that I spent $150 on materials alone. If I ever grow this channel to the point where it's generating real money, and I can make this more of a focus in my life, then sure, I would love to make more big stuff like this. But as a hobbyist who's doing this on the side, it's way too much of a commitment for all the reasons I laid out in this video. With that being said, if you ever want there to be a future where I can focus more on this, I hope you'll like, subscribe, and do all the other stuff the algorithm likes to see. I'll post all of these files online, just check the video description down below for a link. I'll be back next month with another project, and I'll leave you with a couple of pictures of my friend in their finished cosplay.